Thank you for that very generous and I think very helpful introduction. Okay, I'm not using notes. I was asked to give 2 talks, and actually my talk tomorrow is going to say a little bit more about civil Islam. You'll hear a little bit of the rump of, or the front of that discussion tonight, however, as I address a variety of issues, including secularism, secularity, the nature of the state, Islam and democracy that surround these issues. But in any case, before I begin, let me just thank my hosts for this wonderful invitation to return to Malaysia. Saya tidak akan bercakap dalam bahasa Melayu karena bahasa Melayu saya berbau bahasa Indonesia, ya. Jadi maaf saja, ya. So I will be speaking in English. I understand was what I was asked to do, but in Indonesia seringkali sama teman saya Pak Zainal kami menyelenggarakan seminar bersama-sama dalam bahasa Indonesia, tentu saja. But tonight, again, it will be in English. And it's a pleasure to be back in Malaysia. Malaysia is a country in which I visited since the early 1980s. And I've had the great pleasure, actually, of meeting 3 prime ministers, including back in 2004, I was invited to the Caliph conference that Pak Lah had organized. And through a whole series of accidents, I ended up at a luncheon with him and his daughter, who had just was back from Syracuse University, and everybody else in the rombongan who was supposed to have been invited, the really important people, the international Islamic scholars. I'm not Muslim. I was a participant in the conference, but the really important people from Mesir, from Indonesia, from Turkey, were taken to the wrong restaurant. So Pak Lah had a difficult decision. Was he going to sit there for an hour with this American who, wong cilik wae, as we say in Javanese, orang kecil saja, or was he going to actually host him for an hour? And he hosted me for an hour and a half. And I have to say, I know of no politician anywhere in the world who would have been so generous with his time in that situation. And when I think of Malaysia, I think of many things because I know this country. I've been here many times, but I also think of Pak Lah and this remarkable Malay hospitality and generosity that he showed to me that day. So it's a pleasure to be back and to have those memories of Malaysia that I truly appreciate and respect. Final introductory comment. I'm going to begin tonight, as I said, talking a little bit less about, but leading up to the concept of civil Islam. And we'll be sort of giving you a sense of the kind of dialogues in which I engage, whether I'm speaking in a place like Turkey or Indonesia or Malaysia or Mesir, or whether I'm speaking in the United States or in Amsterdam or Paris, where I've been doing research on Muslims and citizenship over the last few years, and I mention this for a very specific contextual reason, where I position myself as someone who's trying to build on what I think is the Malaysian legacy of refuting the clash of civilizations. And that's what I'm going to begin with tonight. And then I'll move beyond that. But I'm sad to say that as a result of a number of developments, this debate, which began in the 1990s, I knew Samuel Huntington. I sat around a table with him at his invitation in the mid to late 1990s. So he had invited me as the kind of pelawan, the opponent of his views. But he was very generous and he allowed me to speak. And subsequently to that, I was frequently invited to Washington, both to government events and to private NGOs, as the person who sort of was regarded as the anti-clash of civilization person. And I'm sorry to say, by way of beginning now, that discourse, which I thought first in the 1990s and then it sort of revived after 9/11 in the United States, but we pushed it back again. But it's back. It's back for several reasons, including, not least of all, The failure, the sad, tragic failure of the Arab Spring reforms, which is, I think, one of the most calamitous events for all of us who love Muslim civilization and who love and value democracy. But it's back also because of the rise of Daesh, ISIS. But it's also back, this clash of civilizations thesis that we thought we had finally beaten back in the 1990s. It's back because of a wave, an extraordinary wave, of Islamophobia that has swept across not just the United States, actually it's less strong in the United States, but especially notable in parts of Western Europe where it was not as notable before. But it is a major phenomenon. With the rise, this resurgent Islamophobia, this hostility to Islam, we've seen a kind of revival of the thesis that the Muslim world is the great exception to the democratizing processes of modern time, and the great exception to the ability to develop the kind of civil society that is required for a real and existing democracy. As I said, that thesis on the essential incompatibility of Islamic civilization, which I will just say again, Malaysian intellectuals were among the most, Muslim intellectuals were among the most sophisticated critics of. And I would have to say, Pak Badawi was also a very, very shining example of a refutation of the Huntington thesis. But it's back, and it's based on much the same arguments as we heard in the 1990s from Sam and others. These types of arguments today may strike us as very old hat, as something that, ya sudahlah, we've argued these things already, but they are back for the reasons that I've mentioned, and they need to be revisited, not just to engage, and in fact tonight I won't do this, not just to sort of refute arguments that for those of us who know Muslim politics, Muslim culture, Muslim civilization, we know and we can with confidence say it's wrong. But it's actually more important to revisit it today in light of things that don't so much have to do with Huntington as they do events in the world, such as the rise of Daesh and, again, the tragic failure of the Arab Spring. All of which raise questions of not whether there is some kind of fundamental incompatibility between Islam and democracy, but whether very specifically, and this is what I'll be addressing, whether there are, if I can speak like a political scientist, whether there are certain path-dependent challenges that Muslim societies face, just as in the West, as they democratized or attempted to democratize in the 19th and 20th century, they too faced certain civilization-specific, path-dependent challenges. Every society, every civilization, as it undergoes processes of democratization, it faces challenges, but those challenges vary. And that's in part what lies behind my comments tonight, to try to understand, well, what kind of challenges do Muslim societies face, and how do those differ, and how do they resemble those that societies, whether they're Western or non-Western societies that are democratizing, face in other parts of the world. Now, to get at this, I'll be talking today, this evening, very quickly. I'll be making 4 points. The first point that I want to talk about tonight is one that I've talked about many times before, and it's the least interesting. But it needs to be said. It needs to be said even in Muslim circles, because if you're not a political scientist, if you're not a comparative democratic theorist, often these facts are not familiar. And the question is, point 1, is there a democracy gap in the Muslim world? Is, for whatever reason, even if we assume, as I know we're all confident, Huntington is wrong, the question may still remain, well, are there challenges that are especially vexing in Muslim majority societies that help us to explain whether there is or whether there is not some kind of, to use the political science jargon, a democracy gap? Now, this is an issue that was revisited many years ago by a friend of mine, much my senior, who just died, I'm sad to say, yesterday, Alfred Stepan, the great Columbia University political scientist and specialist of democratic transitions, who has worked all over the world, but in the last part of his life, He dedicated himself to looking at Muslim majority societies. He knew Huntington was wrong, and he did wonderful research in places like Indonesia, Senegal, Turkey. Tunisia was his favorite case. He knows Ghannouchi very well. He advised Ghannouchi during the first months of the Tunisian transition, after transition to democracy. But in any case, some years ago, Al Stepan, may he rest in peace, Al Stepan wrote a little article with a guy named Graham Robertson on the question of whether there is really a democracy gap in Muslim majority countries. Some people might immediately say, oh, well, of course there is. Look at the Arab Spring. But Graham and Stepan showed it's actually much more complicated. The measure that they used is a very simple one. When you define what is a democracy, you can use all sorts of measures. But the most basic one is the one that's called electoral competitiveness. Electoral competitiveness consists of two qualities. That is the ability of a people, a citizenry, to choose their leaders in free and fair elections. Okay, that's the first quality. The second quality is that once such a person is elected, he or she cannot be vetoed or pushed out of power by some unelected authority except for some criminal offense. In other words, there's not an institution like a Roman Catholic Church in earlier times, or in Iran, a certain religious establishment that can exercise a veto even on the outcomes of elections. So those two characteristics define this very simple but nonetheless important quality that we call electoral competitiveness. And that's what Graham and Robertson then went out and said, okay, let's look at the data, which political scientists are very data-oriented. I'm an anthropologist and a sociologist, so I'm a little less compulsive with regard to these things, but I value them because I am interested in questions of comparison and rigorous comparison. And I think Graham and Stepan gave us a very rigorous comparison. So on the basis of a variety of samples that have been done by these wonkish think tanks like the Freedom House and others, they looked around the world and they said, okay, how do Muslim majorities societies look in terms of this concept of electoral competitiveness defined in terms of the two qualities that I mentioned? And what they found was that when one looks at all Muslim majority countries, which today number roughly 49, at the time they were doing their study it was 47 in 2004, 2005, but roughly and looking at Muslim majority societies, they discovered that actually in terms of electoral performance, 1/3 to 40% of Muslim majority societies actually performed very well in terms of democratic elections, which is a very respectable figure, particularly when one keeps in mind other measures such as the fact that in sub-Saharan Africa and some other parts of the world, Afghanistan, many Muslim majority societies, not all obviously, but a good number of Muslim majority societies are relatively poor, and poverty is another one of those variables that drags down electoral competitiveness and the likeliness of your having a functioning and effective democratic society. So in terms of just those measures, Muslim societies looked pretty good. But the striking thing Robertson and Stepan discovered is that when one looked at those same numbers across all societies, and to their disappointment, and let me emphasize again, Al Stepan was not an Islamophobe. He was a great believer and had great personal ties with major Muslim figures, including Tariq Ramadan in the UK, whom he knew well, even though they were of a different generation. Ghannouchi in Tunisia, he not only knew, they were very, very close on an intimate first name relationship and talked at great length before Ghannouchi went back to Tunisia at the time of the transition about what he hoped, and they discussed what various options were. So Al was not by any means some kind of skeptic of Islam, but what he discovered was that even though in terms of Muslim majority societies, the democratic performance in this 2004-2005 back 30-year period was good, not one Arab majority society figured among the democratic performers. So the title of there, and he did not say this triumphantly, none of us do, and just as I, with my brothers and sisters who are Arab, I feel great sadness in the face of the huge suffering and setback that Arab majority societies in the near Middle East have experienced in the aftermath of the great tragedy, the great hopes and great disappointments of the Arab Spring. So not one Arab majority society fulfilled the simple criteria that Stepan and Robertson provided. So no, there isn't, it turns out, in terms of the simple but important measure of electoral competitiveness, there is not a democracy gap, all other things held neutral, between Muslim majority societies and other societies at comparable levels of development, et cetera, but there does, for a variety of reasons, which I'm not going to go into today, and this is an interesting question that many of us discuss, there does seem to be a democracy gap in the Arab majority world. So the gap is not the result of Huntington's civilization. It's not caused by Islamic civilization. It has to do with variables that are somewhat more path-dependent and particular to Arab majority societies. Again, that's a very interesting question, a very tragic question. I'm not going to say anything further about Arab majority societies today, but for other Muslim majority societies, the democratic performance is quite respectable, contrary to what Mr. Huntington said. Second point tonight. So that was my first point. Is there a democracy gap? No, but there is in the Arab majority world. But no, and not in the Muslim world as a whole. That does not mean that there aren't issues. There are going to be, and I'll talk about this towards the end of my talk, path-dependent challenges that Muslim majority societies face that are different. Some of them are different than Christian or post-Christian societies and or sub-Saharan African societies and so on. I'll come to that towards the end, and that touches on some of the things that I'll then pick up on tomorrow. But the second question has to do with public opinion and support for democratic institutions. None of this will surprise you again, sitting in Malaysia, but keep in mind, much of what I'm talking about is reflects arguments that take place in Western circles, including with my Muslim colleagues and collaborators in this effort to sort of redirect policy thinking. So it has to do how widespread is support for democracy in the Muslim world. And here again, here's the evidence is even more striking. We know, and I think many of you are familiar with this, that the Pew, Gallup, and other polling agencies, including a number in the Muslim Middle East, Mansour Muadal's whose work, I'm sure some of you know, has done fine, remarkable survey work asking Muslims all around the world whether they believe that democracy is a suitable form of government for a Muslim majority society. And the data is overwhelmingly clear. The polling data shows that even in those societies like Egypt, like Algeria, like Syria, like Iraq, which have had difficulty implementing, organizing, bringing into existence democratic institutions, public support for democracy is very, very high. Levels of support, even in the Arab Muslim world, with a few exceptions, and I'll mention them, levels of support for democratic institutions seen as compatible with Islam are just about as high in Muslim majority societies across the board as they are in the West. And in fact, in some Western countries, the rates of support for democracy are lower because you have jaded, cynical publics, cynical about democracy. Indeed, in some other parts of the world, Eastern Europe and of course Russia, rates of support for democratic institutions are significantly lower than they are for Arab or Muslim majority societies. So public opinion, whatever the nature of institutional performance, whether a society actually has institutions that are effectively democratic, the level of support all across the Muslim world, with just a couple of exceptions, is as high as just about anywhere else. It's an astonishing fact of a great cultural and public ethical transformation that has taken place across broad swaths of the Muslim majority world over the last 40 years. It's an amazing ethical transformation. The exceptions will not surprise us. The exceptions are the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, and by some measures, here the data is a little fuzzier, Pakistan, where in a handful of countries, also pre-revolutionary Libya, in a handful of countries, the surveys indicate that the public is skeptical or uneasy with the idea that democracy is a suitable form of government for their own society. But in any case, these exceptions nonetheless illustrate the general rule, which is that across the Muslim world, Muslim majority world, levels of support for democracy are, with just a handful of exceptions, as strong as anywhere in the contemporary world. An amazing refutation, once again, of Mr. Huntington's thesis and, if you will, the neo-civilizationalist arguments to which we are now being treated again in many Western societies. Point 3. Now it's going to get a little bit more complicated. Now I think I'm going to begin to get into some of the issues that I think are more relevant and interesting for many of you in this room, and for myself, I might say as well. And this has to do for the nature of a Muslim public ethics. Point 3. What would a Muslim public ethics look like in a Muslim democracy society, or a democratic society that is Muslim majority? What makes this popular interest in democracy that I've just talked about so intriguing is that it emerged at the same time that other studies have indicated that just as there are high levels of support for democracy across the Muslim majority world, there are also comparably high, typically just a few points lower, sometimes higher, depending on the country, the pattern, but it's very high levels of support for the idea that the state should work to implement values of a broadly Sharia-based nature. This is the question itself is very difficult, and in fact there's been a number of scholars of Islam who have sort of taken exception to the wording of the questions, but nonetheless the general evidence comes in study after study. Most dramatically, I think, in the work of Dalia Mogahed and John Esposito in a book that they published back in 2007 called Who Speaks for Islam, which if you haven't had a chance to read, it's actually a very good read. And they point out that for the most modern Muslims, and I'm quoting them here now, most modern Muslims want neither a theocracy nor a secularist democracy, and would opt instead for a third model in which religious-based principles and democratic values are mutually supported, end quote. So there's the challenge. Now, what does this mean? When one cites this kind of data in certain policy circles in the United States, the United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, the immediate response of some people is to say, see, those levels of support for democracy are actually a kind of Trojan horse, because democracy and Sharia, democracy and Islamic values are intrinsically incompatible. Well, some people of certain persuasions say, some Muslims of certain persuasions do say just that, make that point. And so it's a legitimate question to raise, but I want to make a few points and to sort of qualify that last point. The first thing is that the critics of this view who say, see, this is evidence that when they say they're democratic, they're not really democratic. They are instead trying to revive an ancient primordial tradition. The first point to make is that while this commitment to some variety of Islamic ethics builds, no doubt, on a civilizational tradition, on a deep ethical tradition, in a kind of, if I may speak as an anthropologist and sociologist, a Talal Asadian sense of the term. It's not in any sense a kind of romantic turning back and an ignorance of contemporary realities. It's a Muslim-specific, a path-dependent Muslim-specific variation on the theme of something that's very modern, which has to do with what the Canadian ethical philosopher Charles Taylor calls and I quote him here, what human flourishing is, what constitutes a fulfilled life, what really makes life worth living, end quote. What makes these questions thoroughly contemporary, whether they're asked in Quebec or whether they're asked in a Muslim majority society, is that they're being asked in a context not of neatly bounded traditional societies with secure moral canopies where everybody agrees on the basic ethical grounds of society, as sociologists like my colleague, former colleague Peter Berger, thought traditional societies do. No, this isn't the kind of society in which an Islamic aspiration for democracy and Islamic ethics is taking place. It isn't a traditional society, but this aspiration is taking place in a modern society with its trademark pluralistic competition, a competition of visions, a kind of fragmentation rather than a kind of consensus on religious authority, and heightened public debates over just what the common good should be. And I'll have more to say about that in a moment. As we all know, this pluralization of ideas and authorities is nowhere more striking in Muslim majority societies than when it comes to, again, the theme that lies in the background of my entire discussion tonight, what a Muslim public ethics should look like. In the aftermath of the global Islamic awakening from the 1970s onward, as we know, some activists of a broadly Islamist persuasion, if I may use that term, some activists of a broadly Islamist persuasion concluded that the ethical plurality that they saw around them, the diversity of lifestyles and convictions, even among fellow Muslims, they concluded that this was not an inevitable feature of modern social living, learning, education, differentiation, or an example of the ethical plurality for which classical Islamic traditions, classical fiqh, or fiqh, as Indonesians say, has long recognized. No, it wasn't this. These Islamist activists tended to conclude that the ethical plurality they saw around them was an obstacle to piety, social justice, and a proper Islamic society. It was perhaps not surprising that they reached this conclusion in some countries in the face of regimes of an overtly secularist sort, such as Turkey at one time, or Egypt 30 years ago. But as Tariq Ramadan and others have reminded us, the consequences of such a perspective, such a simple idealization of Islamic norms, can be serious, and Ramadan would suggest unfortunate. Animated by this oppositional confidence, certain activists, again the Islamist activists, reconceived Islamic ethics, reconceived Sharia, not on the model of classical civilization, but on the model really of a modern corporatist state, which is to say they unwittingly reconceived Islamic ethics on the model of, as Sami Zubaydah has put it, this scholar of Islamic law, Sami Zubaydah, they reconceived Sharia on the model of a Western state, a centralized state, a corporate state. It was not continuous with Islamic tradition at all. It was, if you will, a kind of reinvention of Islamic Sharia and a reinvention of Islamic ethics. But things didn't stop there, of course. Once you have people making, as people in all societies, not just Muslim majority societies, but once you have people making arguments about what the public good should be and on what it should be grounded, these kinds of arguments escalate and snowball. The force of this claim in Muslim majority societies, here's the path specificity of the process, the force of this claim in Muslim majority societies only served to deepen debate over just what Islamic ethics is and what the form of Islamic law should be. In other words, rather than sort of settling things, the debate over Islam and Islamic ethics only intensified. all around the world, from Southeast Asia to Western Europe and the Muslim community in the United States with whom I've worked on questions of Islamic ethics. Debates over Sharia and the proper form of Islamic ethics have come to settle on several deeply consequential questions all around the Muslim world. So once the public ethics issue is raised, you begin to, in an Islamic context, it shows a certain path dependency. It settles again and again on certain questions, such as what? And here again I draw on Tariq Ramadan. By what methods and authorities are these traditions called Islamic? Is this ethics called Islamic to be derived and enforced? And are God's commands really positive law like Western law? Are they finished in their form? Or alternately, and I speak of figures that I think most of you will be familiar with, or alternately, as Tariq Ramadan has said in his book on ethics, as Ibrahim Musa has said in his work on ethics, or Muhammad Hashim Kamali here in Malaysia in his writings on the Maqasid al-Sharia, or Muhammad Khalid Masood, the great Pakistani scholar of Islamic ethics and law. All of them building on Abu Ishaq al-Shatibi's scholarship from the 14th century, Common Era. All of them, and they asked, does a proper derivation of Sharia norms and Islamic ethical norms instead require, not this, if you will, reinvention of tradition on the model of Western law, but does it instead require a holistic determination of the spirit of God's law, or the higher aims of the law? In other words, the Maqasid al-Sharia, once again. These are the debates that are, if you will, at the center of controversy all across Muslim majority lands. So the issue of a public good, how are we to live together in a more plural society, is one that's shared in all modern societies, and especially, most poignantly, in democratic societies. In a Muslim majority land, however, that general question assumes certain very path-specific Islamic forms. The pervasiveness and force of these debates across the global ummah remind us that rather than diminishing the ethical diversity of the contemporary Muslim world, movements for the realization of Sharia norms in state and society have only deepened that debate. The contestation is in turn one of the most striking cultural and public ethical challenges facing Muslim civil society today. In other words, to begin the turn towards some of the issues that we'll be speaking about today and tomorrow and the next day. In other words, the question as to what a Muslim civil society will look like is somewhat different from that which one would expect in Western Christian or post-Christian societies, precisely because the public ethical contention that takes place in all societies here will be influenced by this debate over what a proper Islamic ethics and a proper implementation of Sharia norms should look like. Which brings me to my fourth and last point tonight, on path dependencies, and perhaps the point that I should have started with and made the focus. But there was some other work to do. I hope it has not been entirely pointless. Path dependencies toward Muslim civil society. In other words, every democracy needs a civil society, and I'll talk about that. But the question is, are there certain qualities of an Islamic civil society that will distinguish it from others? And I will suggest there are, and indeed there have to be. That's good, even though it is, as you'll also hear me say, and as I said already, a point of contention. So it's this last point on the proper meanings of Islamic ethics in a modern democratic and civil society about which I want to talk now. So what would a Muslim civil society look like? That's what I'm talking about. Now, it's not an abstract idea alone, because we now have a good number of effective and electorally competitive Muslim democracies with civil societies to compare. And we can see that they share some common features. The first is that as a result of the public interest in realizing Islamic values in state and society, as Mogdahed and Esposito, my reference there earlier, point out, the public ethics at the heart of Muslim civil society will assume a slightly different form from that which has prevailed in most of, and please note my words, the post-1960s West, which is a far more, not just secular, and again I'm using these words very specifically, the post-1960s West is not merely a more secular West, it is a more secularist West, and I'll explain what that with reference to the work of Ahmet Kuru, the great Turkish sociologist and political scientist who happens to be a friend, but more on that in its moment. So what I mean by this, what's distinctive about a Muslim civil society, and how does it differ from what we see of civil societies in Western Europe in particular? I'll make a few comments about the United States, but it is different. What we'll see is that as it brings more citizens into the political process, which is to say as it democratizes, Muslim democratization has this striking effect of not privatizing religion and secularizing the public sphere, saying religion, you have your religion, but just in private. In public, religion has no place. Rather than this being the pattern, which I'm suggesting is the general trend in Western Europe, secularism, not just a more secular society. In Muslim majority societies, we should not at all be surprised to see that democratization and the development of a more active civil society will be accompanied by the very familiar pressure for and debates over the proper form and implementation of Islamic values in civil society itself. This will become a path-dependent specific feature of a Muslim democracy and a Muslim civil society all around the world. Nothing surprising there. You might at first say, oh, well, yeah, you're telling us that? But it's actually theoretically very, very important. And so I have to unpack just, well, what does that mean? Because the resulting state-society collaborations, which you'll see put to the fore in Muslim civil societies, cause concern among Western analysts of, again, please note my terms, secularist persuasion. And there's a lot of them. They regard such collaborations, any kind of collaboration between religion and state, religious authorities and states, any movement of religion into public life, any state promotion of religious observance. They regard such collaborations as inimical to the assertive secularism. That's Ahmet Kuru's term, and I won't define it, but assertive secularism that they think has to be implemented if a society, and a civil society in particular, is to be properly democratic. And assertive secularism, in Ahmet Kuru, a phrase, is a secularism that says not just that there shouldn't be a theocratic rule, but says that no, religion has no place in public life and the state has no role to play in the promotion of religious observance or piety. That's assertive secularism, and you're going to hear me suggest that is not a requirement of democracy. That secularist assumption is wrong. People in this room can please take exception. I wanted to put that in the foreground right from the start. These secular critics thus see Muslim desires and Christian desires in parts of Africa or the United States. These Muslim desires to have the state play a role in fostering religious ethics, an active role, as a fatal flaw in the Muslim formula for civil society. That is an uncivil society, they will say. However, I'll take, and it's going to be a kind of nuanced argument, I'll take polite exception to this assertive secularist view. I do so on the grounds that, once again, the assertive secularist view that many policymakers, certainly in Western Europe, but today's significant numbers in the United States, not as many, this assertive secularism misrecognizes the place of religion in the democratizing West. And then it takes that mischaracterization of the way religion worked in the 19th and 20th century West, or in the United States today, it takes this mischaracterization of the way religion, the role of religion in democracy and civil society, and says, that's the model that a society, including Muslim societies, have to adopt if they are to develop a genuinely civil society. Why do I take exception to this view? Why am I suggesting that there will be certain path dependencies in Muslim majority societies that say, no, public religion is a public good. It's okay. And why do I say that this is not in any sense inimical necessarily to democratic development? It has to do with some historical facts and then some contemporary argument. First is, notwithstanding the claims of secularization theorists a generation ago, a high wall of separation, the assertive secularism, a high wall of separation between religion and state was just simply not the norm in Western Europe during the 19th and 20th centuries, when those societies began their development of a civil society that would reinforce the developing democratization of society. A high wall of separation was not the norm. The norm was, on the contrary, all across Western Europe, extensive collaboration between religious and state authorities for the realization of certain religious goods, including the formulation of a public ethics that had a certain, very marked religious coloring. So there was no high wall of separation in the historic West, and yet democracy unfolded. Indeed, an accommodation, a certain kind of accommodation, and I'll characterize that shortly, was indeed a key ingredient and contributor to democratization in Western societies. But just another kind of factual point, in a 2006 study of the separation of religion and state in 152 countries, there's those political scientists again, the political scientist Jonathan Fox has offered a comprehensive reassessment of the religion and state question that also helps us to appreciate that modern Muslim aspirations for a collaboration rather than full-blown high-wall separation between state and religion is not at all unusual. Fox's data show, just a very quick summary of a long 150-page argument, Fox's data show that a full separation of religion and state, as proposed by assertive secularists, is found, and I quote him here, nowhere in the world except the United States. Nowhere in the world. So in preferring a collaborative relationship between religious authorities and the states, Muslim societies, Muslim civil societies, are not somehow going down the path of being the great exception to some tenet of what is required of civil society to make democracy works. So that's first preface. You can have collaboration. Indeed, it's the norm. It's been the norm for religion and state collaboration in democratizing societies. Assertive secularism doesn't exist, has never been a major force for the democratization of the society. As regards Islam and civil society, now I'm going to complicate things a bit. One has to add one fact. Bringing religion into any civil society, I'll repeat that, bringing religion into any civil society where that civil society is marked by heightened rates of political mobilization, which if you've got a good civil society, you like to see that mobilization, you like to see citizens participating. Bringing religion into any civil society marked by heightened rates of public mobilization inevitably presents challenges and poses very real risks. And again, the history of democracy in the West, just as it illustrates there was no high wall of separation, it also suggests that where one brings religion into the public sphere and supports extensive collaboration between religion and state, religious authorities and state authorities, there are both marked benefits but also risks. Risks that arise under certain very specific conditions. What are those risks? Well, let me give you historical examples, very quick. In Western Europe, the 19th century rise of the nation state was not a secular nation state. In the 19th century, most nation states in Europe had strong religious coloring because the state provided extensive support, promotion to certain religions, not all. As we all know, however, this imbrication, it was not a high wall of separation, this imbrication of national identity and religious tensions ultimately took an unfortunate turn. It culminated in the early decades of the 20th century in the destruction of European Jews in the course of the Second World War. In a similar manner, so there are times where you bring religion into the public sphere, you effect some kind of collaboration between state and religious authorities, and the collaboration goes awry. That's what happened in much of democratic Western Europe in the first half of the 20th century. To move forward into a very different context, but one that I think many of you will know well, in a similar manner in India, a democracy. In India since the 1990s, the rise of a harshly populist variety of Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, has been accompanied by a ferocious wave of anti-Muslim sentiment and anti-Muslim violence. There's no getting around that. As the anthropologist Thomas Blom Hansen has observed in a really very interesting study of Hindu nationalism and democracy in India, contemporary India, the anti-pluralist and anti-Muslim currents in the world's most populist democracy were not the result of some kind of exit from democracy, but they had, and I quote him here, emerged out of the longest, most sustained, and most successful trajectory of democracy anywhere in the post-colonial world, end quote. In other words, under certain circumstances, democracy with a certain kind of public religion can go awry, and it can have very, very unfortunate consequences for citizen rights. The example underscores an important fact with regard to religiosity, democracy, and civil society, not just in Muslim civil societies, but in all civil societies marked by significant religious and ethical mobilizations. More specifically, unless it's accompanied by a civil culture, or what Zainal Abidin Bagir, my colleague here, has appropriately called pluralisme kewargaan. Pluralisme kewargaan. Bah, itu istilah yang sangat tepat, sangat dibutuhkan, sangat enak terdengar. Unless it's accompanied by pluralisme kewargaan or some variety of civic pluralist citizenship, democracy, and here again I quote Hansen from India, democracy, quote, very often gives birth to forces, desires, and imaginings of an authoritarian and anti-democratic nature. What's happening in the United States right now is, I'm afraid to say, in my country, another illustration of this. Democratic processes have given rise in certain among my Christian brothers and sisters to an anti-democratic, anti-pluralist assault on my brother and sister Muslim citizens, Muslim Americans. So without that pluralisme kewargaan, without its constant sustenance, civil society in a democracy can go awry. This is a critical point, so let me devote a few final words to this pluralisme kewargaan. In seeking to bring Islamic ethics into public life, today's Muslims are not at all, I hope I've convinced you, the great exception to some democratic norm. Many modern and democratizing societies of a non-Muslim orientation have also been marked by exactly the same aspiration, that is, of bringing religion into public life and having it contribute to both an ideal of and the practice of the common good. At the same time, however, and here's where the populist warning comes in, at the same time, however, no matter what the country or the religious tradition, this is not something peculiar to Muslim majority countries, no matter what the country or the religious tradition, the effort to publicize religion and bring about these collaborations between state and religious authorities presents challenges with regards to how to accommodate religious and ethical diversity, including religious diversity within one's own faith tradition. These challenges may be particularly vexing where pious religious aspirations are used, as they are being used in my own country right now, where pious religious aspirations are being used by certain unscrupulous populist politicians. I don't know who I'm speaking of here, but at any rate, Trump. Certain unscrupulous populist politicians who have no history of piety or religious observance. You want to talk about mafia, an unreligious guy, no figure in American politics that I can remember in my lifetime fits that mold more clearly than Mr. Trump. Yet here he is pretending to raise the banner of protecting a Christian America from secularists and, of course, Muslims. So this low political project that I'm speaking of, whether in the United States or elsewhere, can begin to bleed into and color religious life itself, therefore having very unfortunate implications, whether in the United States or anywhere else, for that sense of citizenship and a shared identity as citizens, as people of a common political project and nation. In Western Europe, efforts to use the state to enforce religious monopolies and coerce religious conformism, we should remember, were also a characteristic of European history from the Christian Reformation in the 16th century onward, up to World War II and the destruction of European Jews. Such cultural controls, such, if you will, these backlashes or unfortunate consequences of an uncivil religion scaled up and brought into the public sphere, only began to diminish in Western Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War. The Jews were gone, and it had as much to do not with heightened levels of tolerance, but with the fact that Western Europeans were simply becoming less religious, unlike their American counterparts, incidentally. So Europeans began to get tolerant on religion or to the degree that religion was no longer a significant force, as it wasn't for many Europeans. However, when Muslim citizens came along and began saying, no, we want to be religiously observant, we want to be able to wear a hijab in school, in a public office, suddenly one began to see that those ethno-nationalist traditions had their own inbuilt intolerances. So let me state my concluding argument here more simply. Just wrap things up. There's no evidence to suggest that public religion, bringing religion into civil society and into some kind of state-society collaboration, is inherently inimical to democracy or a healthy civil society. In fact, that kind of collaboration, that publicization of religion has been the norm in most democratizing societies. Notwithstanding certain secularist mythologies to the contrary, democracy does not require a high wall of separation between religion and state. What it does require, however, and one has to say this immediately, what it does require, however, is that those who would bring religion into the public sphere not use it for the purposes of social exclusion or persecution, but instead, on the contrary, use it to scale up the norms of pluralist citizenship or pluralisme kewargaan by, if you will, using religious appeals to buttress and legitimate citizen values. That, incidentally, is what I'll be talking about tomorrow when I talk about Islam and civil society, Islam and pluralisme kewargaan in Southeast Asia, with a special focus on Indonesia. Whether in the scholarship of Tariq Ramadan, just final words, Nokholish Majid, Abdul Karim Soroush, or any number of other contemporary Muslim intellectuals, one of the ways in which people have proposed, if you will, to bring religion into a creative and constructive dialogue with citizenship ideals is by way of the concept, some variety of the concept, of civil Islam. I'll talk more about this tomorrow. Civil Islam refers, it's not an organized movement, and it's not really even an organization as such. It instead is a Muslim political and ethical ideal. It's a public ethics. It's a public ethics for enacting and organizing Islamic values in state and society so that those values deepen and strengthen pluralism, kewargaan, or civic pluralist citizenship, rather than working against it. And whether in the scholarship of Ramadan, Majid, Soroush, or others, civil Islam, as I have watched it, not just in Indonesia, Malaysia, but also in places like Iran, where it's a real reality and the subject of great reflection, whatever the nature of the political system there, but also in Turkey among some reformists, and all across Western Europe and the United States, when one speaks with Muslim intellectuals who are working on questions of citizenship and the public good. Civil Islam, across this, even if the term is not used, across this array of societies, shows three common characteristics. And just summarizing. Civil Islam is a Muslim public ethic, which, while not avoiding or eschewing collaborations across the state-religion divide, nonetheless seeks to promote a significant separation of powers, a limited, a qualified separation of powers between state officials and religious society. Not a high wall, but a kind of careful surveillance so as to avoid what Soroush most powerfully, and Nukholish Majid, the Muslim reformist intellectual, described as the subordination of high religious ideals to low political intrigues. That's the danger. That's the danger. The subordination of the religious to the political, and to a political that, even though it's speaking in the name of religion, is actually undermining religious values. Second, civil Islam. Even while providing ethical sanctions for a significant differentiation of state and religious authority and personnel, civil Islam takes strong exception to what I've described tonight as assertive secularism's attempts to relegate religious values and practices to the private sphere. No, no, no. A civil Islam could, and indeed it should, support state religious society collaborations that scale up and socialize Islamic values, but just as Tariq Ramadan and Pak Zainal have insisted, it will take care to assure that some, not all, but some among those values are resonant with, reinforcing of, the citizenship norms of freedom and equality across ethno-religious difference. And this is a reality. This is not kind of a projection of a sociologist. This is a reality that one hears in the most diverse contexts around the world. Third characteristic of civil Islam. Civil Islam, as a public ethic, emphasizes, and this is apparent, but it's important to say this. Particularly, it's important to say this to my non-Muslim, Western, American co-citizens. Civil Islam emphasizes that democracy is not a made-in-the-West cultural instrument. Democracy is not uniquely of Western provenance, as Sam Huntington, some of his more florid statements, seems to suggest. No, democracy in the end really doesn't have that much to do with the Greeks. Maafkan saja, my classical scholars friends. It is, above all, an invented modern tradition, created not in the West, but created by modern humans all around the world, not in the West, to deal with the reality of managing social difference in modern, differentiated, plural societies. This is a longer argument, but take strong exception to these civilizationalist arguments that suggest that somehow the genius of democracy was born in Greece. I think there was probably more genius with regard to democracy in the time of the Prophet Muhammad than there was in Greece, if one looks at what was actually, but that's not the point. What we call democracy today is really a strikingly pan-civilizational invention. It's not made in the West. It's made by modern humans struggling to find not just political grounds, but ethical grounds and ethico-religious grounds for living together in difference. That's the heart and the soul of civil Islam as well. My final word. As we stand back and survey our world, it's a sad world in some regards. As we survey our world, after the tragic collapse of the Arab Spring, and that is one of the great tragedies and one of something that broke my heart, has broken my heart. But in the aftermath of the tragic collapse of the Arab Spring, and the equally dramatic and shocking for me, especially if I may say so, rise of Islamophobia, a kind of unadulterated Islamophobia in certain Western circles, it is now more than ever important to state loudly and clearly that Muslim democracy and Muslim civil society are not civilizational oxymorons. Both are realities alive and well and still unfolding in large parts of our world. The civil society that accompanies Muslim democracies or democracies in Muslim majority societies may differ from the post-1960s assertively secularist West in that it will bring religious concerns into the heart of civil society and see that as proper. But there's nothing undemocratic about this. This will, however, inevitably deepen debates among Muslims and others over the proper forms and meanings of those values and whether and how to make those values resonant with others like pluralism and kewargaan. At times, my last sentences, at times these arguments over the basic ethics that are to operate in society for negotiating difference, at times the culture wars, if I may use that term, I don't mean physical wars, but we are in an age of culture wars, and we will see and are seeing culture wars in the Muslim world just as we have seen nowhere more painfully than in the United States. At times, the culture wars in the Muslim majority world may look as if on the verge of spinning out of control and becoming real conflicts, real wars. And that raises concerns. But that, of course, is civic pluralist democracy and civil Islam's whole point. It's why civil Islam is so important. Democracy is not a panacea. Democracy without civic pluralism, without pluralism kewargaan, and that means in a Muslim majority society, democracy without a civil Islam is going to run into all the same challenges that have so plagued democracy in the modern West. So democracy is not the end of history, but it is, we all hope, and I'm confident it will be in many Muslim majority lands. It is the beginning of a new kind of history, a history whereby citizens argue, yes, over serious ethical and political issues, but do so, it's hoped, in civil, respectful, and law-abiding ways, grounded in a religion-accommodating pluralism, kewargaan, or civic pluralist mode of citizenship. Contrary to the claims of certain Western opinion makers and my old nemesis and debating partner Sam Huntington, Muslim civil societies and Muslim democracies of the sort that I've described today are well underway, alive and well across the Muslim world, notwithstanding the challenges of the post-Arab Spring. And their achievement, their reality and their achievement reminds us that civil Islam is needed now more than ever, not just for Muslim majority countries, but for Western societies who so misunderstand the Muslim world. Thank you.